The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness of Bagram Airfield like a blade through silk. Major Evangeline, Phantom, Reyes had been nursing her third cup of coffee when the transmission broke the operational silence that had settled over Afghanistan's most critical airbase. What she heard in those garbled, desperate voices would haunt her for years to come, though she didn't know it yet. The message was fragmentary, coded in the clipped urgency that only came when good men were about to die. Any station, this is Trident 6. We are combat effective but stranded. Repeat, stranded and taking heavy contact. Grid follows. The coordinates that followed placed the SEAL team deep in the Hindu Kush, where the mountains rose like broken teeth against a sky that had no mercy for the living or the dead. Intelligence had labeled the area a no-fly zone after 3 aircraft had been lost to surface-to-air missiles in the past month. The Taliban had moved sophisticated hardware into those peaks, turning every valley into a killing field for anything with wings. Phantom set down her coffee with the deliberate care of someone who had learned to control every micro-movement under pressure. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of a pilot who had logged over 2,000 combat hours, most of them in aircraft that weren't supposed to exist in the places she'd flown them. Her call sign had nothing to do with stealth technology, and everything to do with her uncanny ability to appear in airspace where enemy forces swore no aircraft could survive. The brass had other names for her methods, most of them unprintable in official reports. The operations center buzzed with the controlled chaos of a military machine trying to solve an impossible equation. Phantom watched Colonel Marcus Webb, the base air operations commander, study satellite feeds with the expression of a man calculating acceptable losses. She'd seen that look before, usually right before someone decided that a rescue mission cost more than the lives it might save. The mathematics of warfare were always brutal, but they became obscene when you could put faces to the numbers being written off. "Phantom, you're grounded," Webb announced without looking up from his screens. "Weather's closing in, and that valley's a shooting gallery. We're not losing a C-130 and crew for a 4-man team that might already be KIA." His words carried the weight of command authority, but Phantom heard something else underneath, the sound of a man trying to convince himself that abandonment was strategy, not cowardice. She nodded, knowing that sometimes orders were meant to be acknowledged rather than obeyed. The storm front moving in from the northwest painted the sky in shades of violence, turning the Hindu Kush into a landscape that belonged in mythology rather than modern warfare. Meteorology reported winds gusting to 60 knots with visibility dropping to near zero in the target area. For any rational pilot, these conditions represented an automatic mission abort. Phantom had never been particularly rational when lives hung in the balance, a character flaw that had earned her both decorations and reprimands in roughly equal measure. She made her way to the flight line, where her aircraft waited like a sleeping giant. The C-130J Super Hercules designated Reaper 27 had been her mount for 18 months, a partnership forged in the crucible of impossible missions and sustained by mutual respect. The crew chief, Technical Sergeant Rico Delgado, looked up from his pre-flight checklist with the resigned expression of a man who had learned to read his pilot's intentions in the set of her shoulders. "We're not supposed to be spinning up tonight, Major," Delgado observed, his tone carefully neutral. He'd been working with Phantom long enough to know that regulations were more like guidelines when American lives were at stake, but he also understood that his career depended on maintaining plausible deniability until the moment they committed to launch. "Just keeping her ready, Rico. You know how fast things change around here." Phantom's voice carried the casual tone of someone discussing the weather, but her hands were already running through mental checklists that had nothing to do with routine maintenance. She'd flown rescue missions in conditions that would have grounded commercial aviation for weeks, but tonight felt different. The desperation in that initial radio call suggested men who were beyond their last reserves of luck and ammunition. The loadmaster, Staff Sergeant Jennifer Torch Nakamura, emerged from the cargo bay with grease-stained coveralls and the expression of someone who had been expecting this moment since the first distress call. She'd worked enough special operations insertions to recognize the signs of an off-the-books mission developing in real time. Her specialty was making cargo compartments disappear and reappear as needed, a skill set that had proven invaluable when official channels moved too slowly for tactical reality. Medical supplies are loaded and secured, Torch reported, though no medical supplies had been officially requisitioned for any mission, just in case someone needs them in a hurry. The subtext was clear. If they were going to violate direct orders and risk a court-martial, they might as well do it properly. The bond between aircrew members operated on a level that transcended rank structure and official protocol, built on the understanding that they would either return together or not at all. As if summoned by the gathering conspiracy, Flight Engineer Master Sergeant Kevin Diesel Morrison appeared from the cockpit, where he'd been running diagnostics that no one had requested. His nickname came from his ability to coax performance from engines that should have failed hours earlier, a talent that had saved more lives than most people would ever know. Tonight, his usual good humor was replaced by the grim focus of a man preparing for the kind of mission that ended careers or created legends, with very little middle ground between the two outcomes. The secure radio in Phantom's flight suit crackled with another transmission from the stranded SEAL team, the signal weaker now but still carrying the distinctive calm of operators who had accepted their situation without surrendering to it. The coordinates hadn't changed, but the tactical picture was deteriorating rapidly as enemy forces closed in on the Americans' position. The mathematics of survival were running out, measured in ammunition, time, and the darkness that would give way to dawn all too soon. Phantom looked at her crew, seeing her own resolve reflected in their faces. Sometimes the right choice was also the wrong one, at least according to the manual. Tonight would test whether experience trumped orders, and whether 4 lives in the mountains weighed more than 4 careers on the ground. Webb's voice echoed across the flight line through the base-wide communication system, reminding all personnel that no aircraft were authorized for launch without explicit command approval. The announcement was directed at one specific pilot, though her name was never mentioned. Phantom smiled grimly, understanding that some battles were fought in the spaces between words, where plausible deniability lived and died. 30 minutes to dawn, she announced to her crew, though the significance of that deadline needed no explanation. Daylight would eliminate any possibility of a successful rescue, turning the mission from dangerous to suicidal. The clock was ticking with the relentless precision of military time, where seconds could be measured in heartbeats and minutes could cost lives. The decision point was approaching with the inevitability of gravity, and Phantom knew that hesitation was just another word for failure. The crew began their pre-flight routine with the practiced efficiency of professionals who had learned to prepare for missions that didn't officially exist until they were already airborne. The argument in the operations center could be heard through concrete walls, though the specific words were lost in the institutional acoustics of military architecture. Webb's voice carried the sharp edge of authority challenged, while another voice, younger, more desperate, pleaded for authorization that everyone knew wasn't coming through official channels. The second voice belonged to Lieutenant Commander Jake Poseidon Mitchell, the SEAL team's liaison officer, whose job had become an exercise in watching teammates die while bureaucracy deliberated. Phantom had worked with Mitchell on 3 previous operations, enough to recognize the controlled desperation in his transmission protocols. SEALs were trained to operate beyond the reach of conventional support, but even the most elite operators needed extraction when their luck ran out. Tonight, luck was a commodity in short supply, and Mitchell's team had been spending it faster than they could earn it back. The weather briefing updated automatically on Phantom's tablet, painting an increasingly grim picture of the conditions awaiting any aircraft foolish enough to challenge the Hindu Kush after midnight. Wind shear, icing conditions, and visibility measured in tens of meters rather than miles created a flight environment that existed somewhere between challenging and impossible. The meteorologist had added personal notes, suggesting that any pilot attempting flight in these conditions should update their will and say goodbye to their family. Phantom's family consisted of the crew members currently preparing an aircraft for an unauthorized mission, plus a handful of photographs tucked into her flight helmet of people who wouldn't understand her decision, but would support it anyway. Military families learned to love people who made choices that defied logic and embraced consequences that made no sense to civilians. Tonight's choice fit that pattern perfectly. "Major, we've got company," Delgado reported, nodding toward the operations center where Webb and two military police officers were making their way across the tarmac with the purposeful stride of men carrying orders they didn't want to deliver. The sight of military police at an aircraft suggested that someone had decided to escalate from verbal warnings to physical prevention, crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Phantom checked her watch, calculating distances, time, and the mechanical requirements of getting a four-engine turboprop aircraft from static position to flying speed. The C-130's engines needed time to spool up, and the taxi distance to the active runway meant at least 8 minutes from first movement to wheels up. Webb and his escort were 3 minutes away at their current pace, which left very little margin for discussion or negotiation. "Engines turning in 60 seconds, she announced, her voice carrying across the flight line with the authority of a pilot who had made her decision and accepted its consequences. The crew responded with the coordinated precision of musicians who had rehearsed this song before, though never under circumstances quite this dramatic. The first engine coughed to life with the distinctive whine of military turboprops, followed quickly by the others as Phantom's hands moved through startup procedures that she could perform in complete darkness. Each engine added its voice to a mechanical symphony that announced intentions more clearly than any radio transmission could have managed. There would be no turning back now. No plausible explanations that would satisfy a court-martial board, and no pretending that this was anything other than direct disobedience of a lawful order. Webb broke into a run. The radio erupted with contradictory transmissions as the unauthorized engine start triggered alarms throughout the base's air traffic control system. Tower controllers demanded explanations, while ground control tried to coordinate emergency response vehicles that no one had requested. Through the chaos, Phantom heard Mitchell's voice again, weaker now but still transmitting grid coordinates with the mechanical precision of someone who understood that hope sometimes wore the uniform of the United States Air Force. Phantom released the brakes as Webb reached the aircraft, his face visible in the glow of the navigation lights as he made one final attempt to prevent what everyone knew couldn't be stopped. She couldn't hear his words over the engine noise, but she could read his lips forming the word, grounded, with enough emphasis to shatter careers and court-martial proceedings. She nodded acknowledgement, then pushed the throttles forward and began her taxi toward a runway that would lead either to the greatest success or most spectacular failure of her military career. The weight of command decisions pressed down on every military officer, but tonight Phantom carried the additional burden of choosing between the lives of 4 men she'd never met and the careers of 4 aircrew members who trusted her judgment more than they feared consequences. The mathematics were simple and brutal. 8 lives balanced against regulations written by people who would never have to explain to families why their loved ones weren't coming home. Behind them, Webb stood silhouetted against the operations center lights, already reaching for his radio to begin the process that would ground Phantom's career permanently. Ahead lay, whether that violated every safety protocol ever written and terrain that had claimed aircraft flown by pilots with more experience and better judgment. In between, 4 men waited for salvation that might never arrive, maintaining their positions through courage, training, and the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, was still willing to risk everything for people they'd never met. The runway stretched ahead like a promise written in asphalt and runway lights, leading toward mountains that disappeared into storm clouds and uncertainty. Phantom advanced the throttles to takeoff power, feeling the familiar surge of acceleration that marked the transition from earthbound vehicle to flying machine. At rotation speed, she pulled back on the controls and committed herself, her crew, and her career to a mission that existed in the gray spaces between duty and disobedience, where heroes were made and careers ended with equal frequency. The C-130 lifted off into weather that belonged in pilots' nightmares rather than operational reality. The climb through the storm felt like ascending through the circles of hell, each 1,000 feet of altitude presenting new challenges, designed to test the limits of both aircraft and crew. Ice accumulated on the wings faster than the de-icing systems could clear it, while turbulence threw the massive aircraft around like debris in a tornado. Phantom's hands on the controls became extensions of her will, making constant corrections to keep them on a course that existed more in theory than reality. In the cargo compartment, Torch and Diesel secured everything that could become a projectile while monitoring systems that were being pushed beyond their design specifications. The C-130 had been built tough, designed to operate in conditions that would ground commercial aviation, but tonight they were testing the outer edges of that envelope. Warning lights illuminated the cockpit like a Christmas tree, each one representing a system stressed beyond normal parameters. "Phantom, this is Bagram Tower," the radio crackled through atmospheric interference. "You are ordered to return to base immediately. Acknowledge." The transmission carried the weight of official authority backed by court-martial proceedings and potential criminal charges, but it also carried something else: the knowledge that they were already past the point of no return, both literally and figuratively. "Bagram Tower, Reaper 27, Phantom replied, her voice steady despite the turbulence that threatened to tear the aircraft apart. "Radio interference is making your transmission unreadable. We are proceeding with our authorized mission profile." The lie was technically plausible, though it wouldn't survive the inevitable investigation that would follow tonight's events. Ahead, the Hindu Kush rose like a wall of granite and snow, their peaks disappearing into clouds that concealed anti-aircraft weapons and terrain features that could destroy an aircraft as efficiently as any missile. The valley containing Mitchell's team lay somewhere in that maze of ridges and ravines, accessible only through a corridor of airspace that military planners had classified as unsurvivable for fixed-wing aircraft. The GPS coordinates led them deeper into terrain that belonged on a different planet, where the rules of physics seemed negotiable, and the margin for error had been calculated in increments too small to measure. Phantom descended through cloud layers that obscured everything beyond the aircraft's nose, flying on instruments and faith in roughly equal proportions. At this altitude, in these conditions, there would be no warning if they encountered the granite mountainside that waited somewhere in the darkness ahead. "Trident 6, this is Reaper 27, Phantom transmitted on the frequency Mitchell had been using. "We are inbound to your position with medical supplies and extraction capability. Request status and landing zone information." The transmission carried across the mountains with the power of military radio equipment, but whether it reached its intended recipients remained unknown until the reply came through static and atmospheric interference. "Reaper 27, Trident 6, Mitchell's voice carried the controlled excitement of someone who had stopped believing in rescue, but was being forced to reconsider that position. "We are combat effective but low on ammunition. Enemy forces are maintaining distance but have us surrounded. We need immediate extraction for one urgent surgical case." The tactical picture became clearer with each transmission. 4 SEALs pinned down in a valley by superior numbers, with at least one team member requiring medical evacuation that couldn't wait for official authorization. The kind of situation that created legends or casualties, depending on the competence and courage of the people wearing American uniforms on both ends of the radio transmission. Phantom began her descent toward coordinates that represented either salvation or disaster, guided by instrument readings that made no allowances for the human cost of failure. Behind her, Webb's voice continued to demand her return through radio channels that she had stopped monitoring. Ahead lay a landing zone that might exist only in the optimistic imagination of men who had run out of alternatives to hope and prayer. The valley appeared through the clouds like a vision from another world, carved by geological forces that had no concern for military aircraft or the people who flew them. Steep walls rose on both sides, creating a corridor barely wide enough for a C-130's wingspan, while the floor consisted of terrain that had never been intended as a landing strip. Phantom could see muzzle flashes in the darkness, marking the positions where American and enemy forces exchanged fire with the deadly precision of professionals. "Jesus Christ," Diesel whispered over the intercom, his voice carrying the awe of someone confronting the outer limits of aviation possibility. The landing zone stretched ahead like a nightmare version of a runway, complete with obstacles that could destroy landing gear, surface conditions that could flip an aircraft, and enemy fire that could end the mission before it began. Phantom lined up for an approach that violated every principle of safe aviation she had ever learned, while her crew prepared for a landing that would either enter military aviation history or end their lives in a spectacular display of physics. The choice had been made when they took off from Bagram, but the consequences were about to be determined by skill, luck, and the unforgiving mathematics of high-altitude aviation in combat conditions. Below, 4 men waited for salvation that was measured in the distance between their position and the aircraft that had appeared against all odds and military regulations. The approach corridor funneled down between granite walls that seemed to close with each passing second, creating the illusion that the valley was contracting around them like a stone fist. Phantom maintained her descent rate through instruments alone, trusting altitude readings that could be wrong by hundreds of feet in this terrain, while flying an aircraft that needed every inch of available space to avoid becoming a smoking crater. The first rounds of enemy fire appeared as tracer streams in the darkness, bright lines that marked the boundaries between survival and disaster with mathematical precision. Taliban fighters had positioned themselves on the ridgelines overlooking the valley, creating crossfire patterns that could destroy aircraft as efficiently as surface-to-air missiles. Phantom made no evasive maneuvers that would compromise her approach path, trusting her crew's ability to absorb damage while maintaining flight integrity. Taking fire from multiple positions, Torch reported from the cargo compartment, her voice steady despite the metal-on-metal sound of bullets striking the aircraft's hull. "No critical systems hit so far, but they're finding their range." The C-130 had been designed to absorb battle damage and continue flying, but those specifications had never anticipated the kind of concentrated fire they were receiving from elevated positions. Mitchell's voice cut through the chaos with tactical updates that painted an increasingly desperate picture. "Reaper 27, be advised we have wounded requiring immediate medical attention. Also be advised the enemy has RPGs and is moving into position for direct fire on the LZ." The rocket-propelled grenades represented a threat that could destroy the aircraft even after a successful landing, turning rescue into a mutual death sentence. The landing zone materialized in their lights like something from a fevered dream, a strip of relatively flat ground bordered by rocks that could shear off landing gear, with a surface that looked more like a construction site than anything approaching a runway. Phantom could see the SEAL team's position marked by muzzle flashes and illumination flares, a small island of American firepower surrounded by hostile forces that were closing the noose with professional determination. "Full flaps, landing checklist complete," Delgado announced, his voice carrying the steady professionalism of someone who had learned to focus on controllable variables while ignoring the ones that could kill them all. The pre-landing routine provided a framework of normalcy, in a situation that had moved far beyond normal operational parameters, creating the illusion that this was just another mission rather than a career-ending violation of direct orders. Phantom touched down with the delicate precision of someone balancing on a knife edge, feeling the aircraft's weight settle onto terrain that had never been surveyed, graded, or approved for military aviation operations. The landing roll stretched ahead like a test of faith, with rocks and irregularities that could destroy the aircraft at any moment, while enemy fire continued to bracket their position with increasing accuracy. "We're down and rolling," she announced unnecessarily, since the sensation of ground contact was unmistakable to anyone aboard the aircraft. What remained unknown was whether they would be able to stop before running out of improvised runway, and whether the landing gear would survive the punishment long enough to get them back into the air. The C-130 came to a stop with room to spare, though room was measured in feet rather than the hundreds of yards that characterized normal aviation safety margins. Phantom kept the engines running while her crew prepared for the fastest combat loading in military aviation history, knowing that every second on the ground increased their vulnerability to enemy fire and reduced their chances of successful takeoff. Mitchell's team emerged from their defensive positions like ghosts materializing from the darkness, carrying wounded teammates with the practiced efficiency of special operations soldiers who had rehearsed casualty evacuation, until it became muscle memory. The sight of American forces moving toward the aircraft represented validation of every risk they had taken to reach this point, though the mission's success would be determined by their ability to get everyone back into the air alive. "Medical supplies and space for 4 passengers," Torch called out as the SEALs approached the loading ramp, her voice cutting through engine noise and gunfire with the authority of someone who had managed combat loading operations in conditions that existed outside normal training scenarios. The cargo compartment had been configured for rapid evacuation, with medical equipment prepositioned and securing points ready for immediate use. The first wounded SEAL was loaded with the careful haste of medics who understood that time was measured in heartbeats, while his teammates maintained security perimeters that were shrinking with each passing minute. Enemy muzzle flashes were getting closer, marking the advance of forces that had figured out the aircraft's vulnerability and were moving to exploit it with tactical precision. RPG, 11 o'clock. Diesel's warning coincided with the distinctive whoosh of a rocket-propelled grenade passing close enough to the aircraft to be felt as much as heard. The explosion behind them sent shrapnel rattling against the C-130's hull, while illuminating enemy positions that had moved dangerously close to effective range. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, compressed into the kind of time frame where success and failure were separated by seconds rather than minutes. "Last man aboard," Mitchell called out as he dove into the cargo compartment, his team now reduced to passengers in someone else's aircraft after days of being the primary actors in their own survival drama. The transition from independent operators to evacuees marked a psychological shift that every special operations soldier understood, but none ever got used to experiencing. Phantom released the brakes before the loading ramp had fully closed, beginning a takeoff roll that would either carry them to safety or turn them into a monument to the limits of aircraft performance in impossible conditions. The takeoff run stretched ahead like a gauntlet designed to test every system on the aircraft, while enemy fire intensified to the point where bullets were striking the C-130's hull in patterns that sounded like mechanical applause. Phantom held the aircraft on the ground longer than normal, building airspeed that would be needed to clear the terrain features that waited beyond the valley's mouth like granite sentinels, designed to destroy aircraft that lacked sufficient performance margins. At rotation speed, she pulled back on the controls and felt the C-130 reluctantly leave the ground, transitioning from ground vehicle to aircraft through a process that seemed to take forever while actually occupying only seconds. The climb gradient was marginal at this altitude and weight, requiring every foot-pound of available power while leaving no room for engine failure or pilot error. "Positive rate, gear up," she called out, initiating the sequence that would clean up the aircraft's configuration for maximum climbing performance. Behind them, the landing zone disappeared into darkness, marked now only by the muzzle flashes of enemy forces who had arrived too late to prevent the extraction, but early enough to make the departure memorable. The valley walls rose on both sides like a canyon, designed by someone with no appreciation for aviation safety margins, creating a corridor that demanded precise navigation, while offering no alternatives for aircraft that couldn't maintain their planned flight path. Phantom flew the C-130 through terrain that belonged in a video game rather than real-world aviation, guided by instruments that were accurate to within margins that seemed inadequate for their current situation. Medical emergency in the cargo compartment. Torch's voice carried the controlled urgency of someone dealing with trauma that required immediate attention, but couldn't be addressed until they reached safer airspace. The wounded SEAL was losing blood faster than battlefield medicine could replace it, creating a race against time that was being measured in minutes rather than hours. The climb continued through cloud layers that concealed terrain features capable of destroying aircraft, while Phantom navigated by GPS coordinates and the kind of intuition that came from years of flying in places where mistakes were fatal. Behind them, the Hindu Kush gradually fell away, though the threat of surface-to-air missiles meant that safety wouldn't arrive until they cleared the effective range of weapons that had been deployed throughout the region. Bagram Tower. This is Reaper 27 requesting priority handling for medical emergency, Phantom transmitted, her voice carrying the tone of someone who had completed an impossible mission and was now returning to face consequences that would be determined by people who had never risked their lives for strangers. The official response would depend on whether tonight's events were classified as heroism or insubordination, a distinction that often depended more on outcomes than intentions. The response came immediately. Reaper 27, you are cleared direct Bagram, runway 27, medical personnel standing by. Be advised you are to taxi to the isolation pad upon landing for debriefing and investigation. The instructions carried the weight of military justice beginning its process, though they also contained acknowledgement that 4 American lives had been saved through actions that couldn't be officially endorsed. In the cargo compartment, Mitchell worked alongside Torch to stabilize his wounded teammate, their medical training pressed into service in conditions that civilian emergency rooms would have found challenging. The C-130's cargo bay had become a flying trauma center, where Special Forces medics and Air Force technicians collaborated to keep someone alive long enough to reach definitive medical care. ETA Bagram 23 minutes, Delgado announced, his calculations based on navigation systems that were functioning normally despite the battle damage the aircraft had sustained. The C-130 was designed for this kind of punishment, built to absorb enemy fire and continue flying, though tonight they had tested those specifications more thoroughly than the engineers had ever intended. Phantom flew toward a base where her career would end, and her crew's lives would be disrupted by court-martial proceedings that were already being prepared in operations centers and legal offices. The mathematics were simple. They had saved 4 lives by risking 8, violating direct orders, and demonstrating the kind of initiative that military organizations simultaneously required and punished. Behind them, the Hindu Kush faded into darkness, carrying secrets that would never appear in official reports, but would be remembered in the stories that aircrew members told each other during quiet moments between missions. Tonight had proven that courage could overcome regulations, that individual initiative could triumph over institutional caution, and that sometimes the right choice was also the wrong one, depending on your perspective and the manual you used to justify your actions. The lights of Bagram Airfield appeared ahead like a constellation designed to guide aircraft home, though home now meant facing consequences that would reshape their careers and possibly their lives. The approach to Bagram felt routine compared to the valley extraction, though the sight of emergency vehicles and military police positioned around the isolation pad suggested that their return was being treated as something between a medical emergency and a criminal investigation. Phantom flew the damaged aircraft through a standard approach pattern, while wondering whether she would ever sit in the pilot's seat of a military aircraft again. The landing was textbook perfect, an ironic demonstration of flying skills that would soon be examined by boards of inquiry rather than utilized in operational missions. As they rolled toward the isolation pad, Phantom could see Webb waiting with officials whose presence indicated that tonight's events had escalated beyond local command authority to levels where careers were ended and precedents were established. Medical team is boarding for the wounded, Torch reported as the C-130 came to a stop, engines still running while uniformed personnel moved with the practiced efficiency of military medical professionals. The transition from combat evacuation to hospital care marked the completion of a mission that had succeeded in its primary objective, while failing spectacularly in terms of regulatory compliance. Mitchell appeared in the cockpit as his team was being evacuated, his face showing the exhaustion of someone who had spent days believing that rescue was impossible, and hours discovering that impossible missions were sometimes completed by people who ignored the definition of impossible. "I don't know what's going to happen to you and your crew," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that gratitude couldn't prevent court-martial proceedings. "But I want you to know that 4 families are going to see their people again because of what you did tonight." The military police boarded as the medical personnel departed, creating a symbolic changing of the guard that marked the transition from operational mission to legal proceeding. Phantom shut down the engines for the last time as aircraft commander of Reaper 27, knowing that her next flight would probably be aboard a commercial airliner, taking her away from the career that had defined her adult life. Webb approached the cockpit with the expression of someone carrying orders that he respected but didn't necessarily agree with, his face showing the conflict between military discipline and personal admiration for what had been accomplished in violation of his direct orders. "Major Reyes, you are confined to quarters pending investigation and court-martial proceedings," he announced, his voice carrying the formality required for legal proceedings that were already being documented by court reporters. "Understood, sir," Phantom replied, her voice steady despite the knowledge that her career was ending in a flurry of legal proceedings that would examine every decision made during a mission that had lasted less than 4 hours, but would be debated for years in military justice classrooms and ethics seminars. The crew was escorted away separately, each facing their own version of consequences that would be determined by officials who had never flown rescue missions in impossible conditions or made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for people they had never met. The C-130 sat on the isolation pad like evidence in a criminal case, its battle-damaged testament to risks taken, and survived in service of a mission that existed in the gray area between heroism and insubordination. In the base hospital, surgeons worked to save the life of a SEAL whose survival depended on medical intervention that had become possible only because an Air Force crew had chosen to ignore direct orders in favor of a higher duty that transcended regulatory compliance. The operation succeeded, adding another name to the list of people who would live because someone had been willing to risk everything for strangers. Mitchell filed his after-action report with the kind of detail that special operations soldiers learned to apply to missions that would be examined by people who needed to understand exactly what had happened and why. His account would become part of the legal record that would determine whether Phantom and her crew were heroes or criminals, a distinction that often depended more on political considerations than operational results. The investigation would take months, involving testimony from participants and expert witnesses who would examine every aspect of a mission that had violated regulations while succeeding in ways that couldn't be measured in courts-martial or efficiency reports. The legal proceedings would determine careers and precedents, but they would also establish whether military organizations could adapt to situations that hadn't been anticipated by the people who wrote the rules. In her quarters, Phantom wrote letters to family members who would read about tonight's events in newspapers before hearing the full story from official sources. Military families learned to love people who made impossible choices, but they also learned to fear the consequences of courage that exceeded the boundaries of acceptable risk and regulatory compliance. The story would spread through military networks faster than official reports, carried by aircrew members who understood the calculations that had been made and the prices that would be paid. In ready rooms and flight lines around the world, pilots would discuss a mission that proved courage could overcome impossible odds while simultaneously destroying the careers of the people who demonstrated that courage under conditions that left no room for hesitation or second thoughts. Years later, the mission would be taught in military academies as a case study in leadership, decision-making, and the conflict between individual initiative and organizational authority. Students would debate whether Phantom had made the right choice, though by then her career would have ended, and the lives saved that night would have continued with the kind of ordinary happiness that makes extraordinary sacrifice worthwhile. The Hindu Kush kept its secrets, as mountains always do, while the people who had challenged those peaks and survived carried different secrets in the form of memories that would define how they understood courage, duty, and the price of doing what was right when regulations said it was wrong. The court-martial proceedings began 6 weeks later, in a military courtroom that had been designed for cases involving clear violations of military justice, rather than situations where heroism and insubordination occupied the same actions. Major Evangeline Phantom Reyes sat at the defendant's table wearing her dress blue uniform, with decorations that testified to a career spent in service of missions that often required choosing between competing definitions of duty and honor. The prosecution's case was straightforward. She had violated a direct order, endangered her crew, risked a multi-million-dollar aircraft, and compromised base security through unauthorized flight operations in hostile airspace. The charges were supported by recorded communications, radar tracks, and testimony from officers whose authority had been directly challenged by her decision to launch without permission. The defense strategy proved more complex, built around testimony from the people whose lives had been saved and expert witnesses who could explain the tactical situation that had made immediate action necessary. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell testified about the condition of his team and the time constraints that had made official authorization impossible, while military physicians described the medical emergency that had required evacuation within hours rather than days. Phantom's attorney, a military lawyer who specialized in cases involving special operations and combat aviation, argued that the charges failed to account for the higher duty that military officers owed to personnel in extremis. The legal concept of competing loyalties became central to a defense that acknowledged regulatory violations, while maintaining that those violations had been justified by circumstances that transcended normal operational parameters. The courtroom filled with military personnel during breaks in testimony, as word spread through the base about proceedings that were determining whether the military justice system could accommodate the kind of initiative that special operations required, but regulations prohibited. The case had attracted attention from media outlets that specialized in military affairs, though official restrictions on coverage meant that most details would remain classified until long after verdicts had been reached and sentences served. Phantom testified on her own behalf, describing the decision-making process that had led to a mission she knew would end her career, but might save American lives. Her voice remained steady as she explained calculations that had been made in minutes, but would be examined for months by people who had never faced similar choices under comparable time constraints. "I understood that I was violating a direct order," she acknowledged under cross-examination, her words becoming part of a legal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. I also understood that 4 American servicemen would die if someone didn't take action immediately. I made a choice based on priorities that I still believe were correct, regardless of the personal consequences. The prosecution questioned whether individual officers should be permitted to override command authority based on their personal assessment of tactical situations, arguing that military discipline required adherence to orders, even when those orders seemed wrong to subordinates. The case had implications that extended far beyond one unauthorized